We all hear about form follows function, right?
Right.
But what if, and stay with me here,
Okay.
what if it's more like form follows communication?
Interesting.
That's kind of the whole deal with Conway's law.
Yeah.
And that's what this deep dive is all about. We've got a whole stack of research, articles, the works. We're going to see how this law, this idea, plays out in tech, business.
Yep.
I mean, even in our families, probably.
Oh, absolutely.
So buckle up. This is going to be a deep dive into a law that, honestly, shapes way more than we realize.
It really does. It's incredible how a concept from way back in 1968 is still so relevant today.
Oh, for sure.
Melvin Conway, the guy who came up with it, he said, well, the quote's a bit wordy, but it boils down to organizations that design systems. They're basically forced to make designs that are like copies of how they communicate.
Yeah. It's like their communication structure gets baked into the final product.
Exactly.
But he wasn't just talking about software, was he?
No, not at all. This applies to, well, any system you can think of. The core idea is this: how easy or hard it is for a group to talk to each other. That has a huge impact on whatever they create.
Makes sense. Whether it's an app or, like you said, a family trying to plan a vacation.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so let's get specific. Let's say there's a tech company, right?
Okay.
And they've got those like classic dev teams.
Yeah.
You know, front end, back end. And then the database folks off in their own little world.
Oh, yeah, the database people.
Each team, they're all super talented, right?
Yeah.
But they mostly stick to themselves.
Oh, I've seen this so many times. And you know what happens? What you get is a system that's, well, it's a mirror of those silos.
Oh, interesting. So the final product, even if it works technically,
Yeah.
it's probably going to be clunky.
Often, yeah. Not very user-friendly.
Because it's like the software itself is made of these separate pieces.
It's like they bolted different things together. And look, this isn't about blaming devs. It's more about how human nature
Right.
and how companies are organized. It kind of creates these constraints.
So it's not about individual skill. It's more like the way the team is set up really impacts what they make.
Exactly.
Which makes me think about families, you know?
Oh, yeah?
Like,
Yeah.
if everyone's used to talking to only one parent about certain things, it probably messes with how decisions are made.
For sure. And that's why getting this whole Conway's Law thing is so helpful.
Yeah.
It helps us make sense of these dynamics. In fact, one of the articles you sent over, it had some key takeaways that are really worth highlighting.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first one is system modularity that often just reflects team silos.
Interesting.
The more rigid the teams are, the more rigid the outcome's going to be.
Right. Like, if your team is structured like a bunch of puzzle pieces, what you end up with is a puzzle, not this nice, smooth, integrated thing.
Exactly.
Okay, what's takeaway number 2?
Communication equals integration. Basically, the easier it is for groups to talk to each other, the better the final product's going to be.
This just flows better.
Totally.
Yeah.
And this applies to way more than just software.
Like what?
Think about marketing campaigns or writing a research paper with a bunch of people. Anything where you got to collaborate.
Gotcha. So better communication, more integrated outcome. What's the third one?
This one's a bit of a mind blower. Conway's Law, it impacts everything.
Everything.
From software to societies, I mean, even how our brains are structured.
Yeah.
This principle is at work, shaping complexity everywhere.
Whoa. Okay, that's a lot to take in. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, there's one thing I got to ask about. The article mentioned Conway's Law inversion.
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
Okay, so up until now, we've been talking about communication influencing design, right?
Right.
Inversion is about flipping that. It's like saying, hey, what if we intentionally design how we communicate to get the outcome we want?
Oh, I see. So if I'm making, I don't know, a mobile app.
Okay.
And I want it to be super flexible, easy to adapt.
Yeah.
I should make sure my teams are set up that way from the get-go.
Exactly. You want a flexible, adaptable system. You need flexible, cross-communicating teams. And we see this in action in the real world, with things like agile methodology.
Oh, right.
That's all about having those cross-functional teams, always talking, constantly iterating. It's Conway's Law inversion in practice.
Interesting. So it's not just about having the latest project management software or...
Nope. It's deeper than that.
Yeah.
Tools are great, but it's really about the culture,
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of real-world stuff, the research you sent, it had a whole section on open source software.
Oh, right.
I think that's a perfect example of Conway's law in action.
Totally. Open source projects are wild, right? You've got people from all over the place
Yeah.
contributing code, working together, but often they've never even met face to face.
It's amazing how it works. And if you think about how those projects are structured, they're decentralized. People contribute to different parts of the code based on, like, their skills and what they're interested in.
It's like beautiful, organized chaos, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And that structure, you see it reflected in the software itself.
Oh, how so?
Open source software, it tends to be more modular. Things are, like, loosely coupled, which is great because it makes it flexible, and it means people can contribute without messing up the whole thing.
It's like the software is a mirror of the community that made it.
Totally. Decentralized community, decentralized architecture.
Makes sense. But what happens when you look at a totally different organization, like a big traditional company?
Good point. You see a very different communication structure there.
Oh, yeah.
You get those hierarchies, layers of management, very distinct departments.
It's like the opposite of the open source world.
Often, yeah. And guess what?
What?
That structure, all that hierarchy and those silos, it usually leads to software that's just as rigid.
Oh, wow.
Big monolithic applications.
Because it's mirroring the communication patterns inside the company.
Precisely. Information flows slowly, decisions get stuck at the top, there's not much collaboration between different teams.
So even if a company like that tries to modernize, use new tech, if they don't fix how they communicate, they're probably just going to end up with the same problems.
You got it. They might have the fancy tools, the new frameworks, but if the communication's still messed up, they're not going to see the benefits. It's like, I don't know, putting a new coat of paint on a house that's falling apart underneath.
It's a good reminder that technology is only part of the equation. The human side, how we talk and work together, it's just as important.
Couldn't agree more.
But this idea goes way beyond software, right?
Oh, yeah.
The research talked about Conway's law and how it might even apply to, like, society as a whole. That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. If you think of society as this giant system with all these people and groups, then how we talk to each other, it's got to influence how that whole thing is structured.
We talk all the time about how social media has changed communication, right?
For sure.
On the one hand, we're more connected than ever, but then you see all this polarization, people stuck in their own little echo chambers.
Right. It makes you wonder, could that be Conway's law at work?
Oh, interesting. You mean like our communication patterns actually shaping our political systems?
Maybe our economies, our culture. It's a huge question.
It really is. And what about AI? All this talk about artificial intelligence, these complex algorithms.
Right. Algorithms that learn from the data we feed them.
But who's designing those algorithms and who's choosing the data?
Humans, with all our biases and weird ways of communicating.
Exactly. So if Conway's law holds up, could it be that the AI we're building is actually a reflection of how we think and interact?
It's a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
And kind of scary, right?
It is a little bit, yeah. Like, are we baking our own biases into these super powerful systems?
And what's that going to mean for the decisions those systems make?
Big questions. But it's so important that we're talking about this stuff now.
Definitely.
It seems like Conway's law gives us this whole new way of seeing not just how we build software, but how we build everything, even society itself.
It's a reminder that the systems we make, they're not neutral. They're reflections of us, our values, how we talk to each other.
Yeah. And understanding that can help us make better choices about the kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly.
That's powerful stuff. But before we get lost in the big picture, let's bring it back down to earth for a sec.
Right. What can people listening actually do with this knowledge?
So far, it seems like we've mostly been talking about Conway's law as a way to, like, understand how things work.
Yeah.
But can we actually use it, like, to make things better?
I'm so glad you asked that. Because remember that Conway's law inversion thing we talked about? That's where the magic happens. Instead of just noticing how communication shapes things, we can actually design those communication structures to get the results we want.
So it's like we're not just observing anymore. We're like architects.
Exactly. Architects of communication.
Okay, but how do you actually do that in the real world?
Okay, let's say you're facing some big challenge. Could be a new product.
Yeah.
Or even reorganizing a whole company. The point is, instead of just throwing people at it randomly, you can use Conway's law to be more intentional.
Okay, I'm listening.
First step, you got to be super clear about what you're trying to achieve, what kind of system, product, whatever are you aiming for.
Okay.
Do you need something flexible that can change quickly?
Yeah.
Or something that's more like rock solid and dependable?
Got it. So let's say I'm making a new social media platform, right?
Okay, yeah.
And my goal is to make it super engaging, really user-friendly. That's my starting point.
Exactly. Now you take that goal and you start thinking, what kind of communication setup would best support that? In your social media example, you'd probably want teams that can work across different functions, right?
Makes sense.
And they got to be able to react quickly to what users are saying.
Yeah. It's almost like I'm designing the communication blueprint to match the kind of platform I want.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
But here's the catch, okay? It's easy to draw these nice structures on paper.
Right.
But making them work in real life, that's the hard part.
Yeah. You can't just rearrange some boxes on an org chart and call it a day.
Nope. You might have to change teams, reporting lines, bring in new communication tools. You might even need to rethink the whole office space.
It's about creating an environment where those communication patterns can actually happen.
And that's where leaders come in.
Oh, how so?
They got to be the champions for these changes, you know? They got to be the ones modeling the right behaviors.
Right, walking the walk.
Exactly. And build a culture where open communication, where collaboration, it's actually valued.
You know, it makes me think of a gardener. Like, they carefully prepare the soil, give the plants the right conditions to grow.
Beautiful analogy. But all this talk about designing communication, it makes me wonder, are there limits to Conway's law? Can we really control how people talk that much?
Yeah, good question.
And it brings up a really important point. People are complicated. And communication, it's often messy. We can't control every single interaction.
Right.
But we can influence those overall patterns.
So it's less about being a control freak and more about, like, creating the right environment.
Exactly. Setting the stage, giving people the right tools, and then trusting them to do their thing.
And even if we can't totally engineer the perfect outcome, just knowing about Conway's law helps us avoid some common mistakes.
For sure. And be more deliberate about how we approach things.
Okay, this is making a lot of sense. But for our listeners out there, how can they actually apply these ideas, like in their own work, their own lives?
Well, first, just start paying attention.
To what?
To the communication patterns around you. Next time you're working on a project, take a step back. Observe how people are talking to each other. Are those patterns helping things move forward? Or are they getting in the way? If you could redesign them, what would you change?
It's like putting on your Conway's law glasses, right? Seeing the world from this new angle.
I love that. And second, for anyone out there who's in a leadership role, think about how you're setting up teams. How are the communication channels structured? Are you encouraging people to collaborate? Or are you accidentally creating silos and bottlenecks?
That's such good advice. And I'd add one more thing. Don't forget about culture.
Oh, right.
Even with the best structures, the best tools, if your culture doesn't value good communication, you're going to have a tough time.
Absolutely. So to wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
it seems like Conway's Law is way more than just some cool concept.
Right.
It's this powerful tool. We can use it to understand, design, and even optimize the systems around us.
And not just software, but like we said, even how our societies work.
It's a lens to see the world differently and a lever to shape the future.
Powerful stuff. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Conway's Law. But as always, the exploration doesn't stop here.
Keep those communication channels open, and we'll catch you next time.